Hello, I'm Tommy Henderson, and we're going to be showing you how to install a rear track bar on a Ford F53 motorhome. First, I'll just note, so this is the SS401, and it is designed to fit 98 through 2020 F53 motorhomes, so that's with the V10, and specifically 20 to 22K. I will note that this kit comes with both a standard and a metric bracket along with associated hardware. In this case, the coach does take the metric bracket, and I've only got the metric hardware here. Once we take a look at the rear differential, I will explain to you how to determine whether it's metric or standard. But so differential bracket, we've got, of course, our track rod here. Then we have our frame bracket and our pinch plate where the track rod will mount to on the frame side, and our related hardware. So now let's take a look at the axle housing, and we'll go over how to determine whether it's metric or standard. If you look at your fasteners on the housing, you'll notice that they will either have raised numbers, so these are grade 10.9. If they show numbers on them, they are metric fasteners, so it's a metric axle housing. If they have straight lines radiating out from the center, that would be an SAE standard, and that will determine which of the two differential brackets you would use. If you hold up your bracket, the fitment will make it clear that if you're trying to install a standard bracket on a metric axle or vice versa, the holes aren't going to line up right. So you'll notice these bolt holes are empty currently, so there's two over here and then one up here. So that is where the differential bracket will mount. And the reason those are currently empty is because this coach actually did already have the SS401 Rear Track Bar installed. We do actually have a video posted of my uncle John Henderson going through the installation process. Very good video, but it was using older hardware, so we wanted to redo it showing the latest hardware that we have. Okay, so we're going to start by installing the axle bracket. And just kind of see, before you actually install it, hold it up here. See how we've got this notch cut in there. It's designed to rest on top the differential axle housing there. So now we're aligned with those three holes. So I will point out also, this brake line tends to be really close to where this bracket is. So we do provide in our kits split conduit and nylon tie straps so that you can protect the brake hoses and pull them away from this axle bracket to make sure that as that axle moves up and down, you're not going to be rubbing on your brake lines. So again, that's already been done because this product was already installed on this particular coach. All right, so we've got our metric bolts and lock washers and flat washers that are included in the kit. Again, there are two different sets of bolts and lock and flat washers. If you're using, again, the metric axle bracket, be sure to use the metric hardware, and vice versa. If you're using the SAE standard bracket, use the SAE standard hardware to mount that bracket to the axle. Apply some Loctite to our bolts. Again, get it lined up in the same area where we just showed you. Get all three of the bolts started back into axle housing. Always a good idea to start your bolts by hand. Make sure that the thread is nicely engaged before you start hammering on them with an impact wrench to avoid cross threading. Definitely don't want to mess up the threads on your axle. All right, I've got my 22mm socket and impact wrench. I do have a wobble on here because the passenger side bolt is just a little bit tight to get to around the parking brake drum, and I'm not going to be hammering on these too much. I'm going to just run them down to fairly tight, and then I'm going to use the torque wrench to get them all the way to their spec. So we'll start over here. Okay, got our torque wrench we'll refer to our instructions here. For item 16 in this case, because it is the metric bolts, we have a torque spec of 142 to 158 foot-pounds. We'll go about 150. All right, now that our differential bracket bolts are torqued to spec, we're going to go ahead and install our frame bracket assembly. So we've got our frame bracket and our pinch plate. So they're going to sandwich around the frame. This will be on the bottom of the frame. These bolts will come from below and thread into the pinch plate. So let's go ahead and put some Loctite on those. So we're going to start by loosely assembling this on the frame. Once we get this assembled and in place on the frame, we're going to use our track rod to confirm where exactly it needs to be. So we'll show you that in a minute. And careful working around the wiring on the coach. Again, this is all protected with split loom conduit, so no concerns about rubbing there, but just make sure that you're not tugging on them excessively as you're working with the frame bracket. Both of those have been started. We can use our impact wrench just to run them down a little bit. I just want to get it to where it's held in basically the correct position on there. We're not going to tighten them down all the way yet because we will use the track rod to confirm where this needs to be fore aft on the frame. We'll go ahead and run these down just a little bit. We don't want to go too much with it. All right, we got them tightened down just enough where it still slides front to rear, but it's held in place. It's not going to topple. All right, now with the track rod, I'm going to go ahead and use it to adjust where our frame bracket and pinch plate are located. And I will note that the track rod can be installed on either side of either one of the brackets. Typically, we'll have the rod on the front side of the axle bracket and the back side of the frame bracket. We have seen before where people have removed the bump stop from the frame because they thought that this frame bracket had to be located in that area, and that is not the case because you can have the track rod on the back side of the pinch plate and frame bracket assembly. So we'll just hold it up there and check. That's about right. Okay, so we've got our bottom bolts just snug. We're going to go ahead now and tighten up our 1/2-inch screws to push our pinch plate into the frame. And it's important not to go too tight on this. If you go too much, then it can start to bend up. You want to go just to where it starts to push into the frame. Once I get these set to that point, then I'm going to go ahead, tighten my bottom bolts, get them torqued to spec. Okay, now we're going to go ahead, we'll tighten up our bottom bolts. Okay, now we're going to tighten the larger bolts that go through the frame bracket into the pinch plate to our 100 foot-pound spec. Okay, now that we've got our bottom bolts torqued to spec, we're going to go ahead and torque these two to spec as well. So we've got a 40 foot-pound torque spec on those. It's important to make sure that as you're tightening these down, that the jam nuts are backed off far enough that you're not starting to run down on the jam nut first before you actually have the bolt or set screw itself in far enough. So I will go ahead, torque those to spec. Before we tighten down these set screws, we're going to go ahead and put some Loctite in for the jam nut. So want to make sure that jam nut stays pinched down and doesn't back out. Normally the kit would include liquid red Loctite. Right now we have the gel, so we're just going to scrape a bit in there. To the other side. All right, we got our torque wrench again. These are 3/4 inch heads on the bolts, and we're going to run it down to just about 40 foot-pounds, so we're not going real tight on this. Again, we don't want to make it start to bow out. Okay, now that the set screws themselves have been torqued to spec, we're going to go ahead and run down our jam nuts with just an end wrench. So we want to get these just tight. All right, now we're ready to install our track rod. So we've got our adjuster free on this side so we can adjust the length of the rod assembly. Now I will note, it's very important when you install this that your washers go on both sides of your bushings. You want to make sure that that bushing is captured by the washer. Otherwise, if you just have the bolt head there, that can sometimes pull the bushing, pull the inner sleeve out of the bushing, and your track rod would not be fully anchored. We'll put our bolt in from the back. In some instances it's critical which way the bolt faces, and this one not so much because we do have a fair bit of room here. Main thing is, as I mentioned, just want to make sure that you've got both your flat washers on either side of the rod assembly. Alright, as you can see, we hold it up to our frame bracket and we're straight across. We're not going at an angle front to rear at all. So now we're just checking our adjustment on the rod end, and it looks like we're in pretty good shape here. So again, we're going to run the bolt through with a washer on both sides of that bushing. Okay, so we got the rod in place. Now we're going to go ahead and tighten down the bolts on the ends. We'll go ahead and run them down with the ratchet, with the impact wrench first. Okay, we've got those run down pretty tight with our impact wrench. Going to go ahead and do one more check, make sure that alignment looks okay. We're running nice and straight across. The bar has room to move up and down. The bar's not gonna rub on the differential bracket. So now we'll go ahead, torque these to spec, and then we'll tighten our jam nut down on the rod end. All right, our torque spec on the two large bolts on either end of the track rod itself is 150 to 180 foot-pounds. So let's just split the difference and do 165. All right, now for the final step, now that we've got both ends of the rod torqued to spec, we're gonna go ahead and put some red Loctite on the threaded rod end assembly. Just smear that in there. Now we'll go ahead and tighten our jam nut down. Torque for this is really an approximation, since the only way to actually use a torque wrench to tighten this would be to use a crow's foot, and we don't need to be that precise with it, so we're looking for somewhere between 100 to 150 foot-pounds. Just make sure that's going to be tight. It's not going to back off and allow the rod to work its way around at all, allow the threads to be working back and forth. We want to hold it tight. So that's also what our Loctite is there to do, to make sure that that jam nut does not work its way loose. All right, and with that, our installation of the SS401 Rear Track Bar is complete. As always, we wish you safer and happier driving.